So we work in, for example, cancer to understand cancer progression, immunotherapies like immune checkpoint inhibitors and oncolytic viruses. In my PhD or my postdoc, I worked on HIV, which is here. But we also work on acute myeloid leukemia, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Oh, sound just came on. Okay, perfect. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and of course, viral respiratory diseases. So we work on influenza, and probably like everybody in this room, we worked on COVID. You might have met my students, Sonia and Xiaoyan, at the poster session, who are looking at using virtual clinical trials and virtual patient cohorts to understand disease mechanisms. So one of the approaches we use in the lab is to focus on a disease and build a mathematical model from first principles, so of the mechanisms that are important for that disease. In COVID, for example, we think of models of T cells, B cells, antibody, macrophages, monocytes, neutrophils, the cytokines that orchestrate this response, and their interactions with virus. And then we build virtual or generate virtual patients, which are really just sets of parameters that are sampled from experimental studies and clinical studies to recapitulate true patient trajectories. And if those patients match what we know clinically or experimentally, we accept them into cohorts. And you might see here that the purple cohort is the same quote unquote people as the blue cohort. The advantage of this strategy is that we can match, we can twin patients into different cohorts and then look at how they respond differently under different conditions. And so therefore we can get a real causal sense of what's driving a disease response or what's driving a treatment response. And then we run in silico clinical trials in certain contexts, which is to look at different treatment strategies, dosing regimens, dosing frequency, and then those are implemented by our clinical collaborators at the hospital or elsewhere. And so I gave you this just to give you an insight into where I'm coming from, where am I talking about this. We do mathematics, so we work within the sphere of NSERC, but we're also doing a lot of health-based research, so we work within the sphere of CIHR. And so this is my disclaimer. Usually if you're at a pharma talk, the disclaimers are, these are my opinions. These are my opinions. I don't know whether this will be helpful for everyone or anyone, but I hope it is. What I say today is not the only way to write a grant, and hopefully people write their own grants their own way and get them funded. Some of these slides come from a course that I took during my postdoc, which we'll talk about because I think that that's an important thing to do as you're starting to write grants. It's called Successful Grant Writing Strategies. My focus, like I said, will be mostly on CIHR and NSERC, and obviously you won't have 100% success because you came to this talk, because I don't have 100% success, and I'm giving the talk, so no one has 100% success. Okay, so the first thing you need to know when you're writing a grant, and this is from the Harvard course, is that you are constrained by the scope of the grant, the time you have, and the money you're gonna have. If you have, so the scope is the breadth of what you're gonna do. What do you want to propose to study? The time is the time you're going to dedicate either in person resources or in other things, computational time, et cetera. And cost is what the money you have to do what you're going to want to do. If you have a big scope, you're going to need a lot of money, and you're probably not going to have all the time. So you're going to have to balance these three things, and they are constraints, and you're under these constraints at all times when you're doing research. And so when you're writing your grant, you have to think about how reasonable it is to propose what you want to do within the time that you're going to do it and within the money that's allowable within the competition. So for some of you, your PhD students and postdocs, you get a scholarship with a fixed amount. You probably don't need to worry so much about the cost because you're paying for your bursary. But once you start writing grants, you're going to be paying, you have to calculate the costs of what it's going to cost for your team. And so that's budgeting is an important part of writing grants. You're probably all familiar with this, but this is the Tri-Council in Canada. It's formed of the CIHR, the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. They fund health research. The Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, primarily to advance knowledge in natural sciences or engineering. That includes your math work or your statistics work, all your theoretical and methodological advances. It can be tricky to separate these two. I work in health. When I propose things to NSERC, I have to tell them why what I'm doing is important from a non-health standpoint. And you have to be able to distinguish those two, and we'll kind of get to that at the end. There's also SSHRC, which is the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. If you're working in things like public health, where you may have outreach to social determinants of health or things like that, you may also be involved in SSHRC research. I'm involved in a grant that we're writing right now with an artist. So it's with people in the humanities. So you may go there, but I'm just saying now, it's my first time applying to something in the humanities, so I have no real experience with SSHRC research. In your province, you may also have similar structures. I know in Quebec, for example, we have a tri-council ourselves. They also fund, in the same sense, the three different axes of the tri-council. And so you can kind of double up and propose pilot grants and to the provincial funding mechanisms that will help you be funded at the national level, and students can also apply to both. So I don't know if that exists in all provinces. I don't think that exists in Ontario, I'm not sure. I know Research Manitoba exists because I did my master's in Manitoba. And so that kind of is an overview of government funding. But don't forget, there are other places you can go to get funding. You can get non-governmental funding from industry and foundations and philanthropy. So these include things like the Cancer Research Society, the Cole Foundation, which I think is only Quebec, the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, which is more a humanities thing. But there are organizations that are private donors, essentially, that fund research. Let's think about them. So the first thing you need to do is, does your organization match your research priorities? I probably will never apply for a Trudeau grant because it doesn't apply to my work, but it may apply to yours. You definitely need to show a direct impact on what they're working on. The Cole Foundation, for example, works on pediatric and young adult blood cancers. So when I get funding from them, I'm not proposing to do something on solid tumors. You have to have a clear impact on whatever they're interested in. You can use institutional grant databases to find these kinds of grants. The big grant organizations, CIHR and NSERC, they run yearly competitions. So does the Cancer Research Society, et cetera. They also have targeted funding streams. Use things like Pivot. If you don't know what that is, probably your organization is, your institution is subscribed. It's like a grants database. Your institution or your institutional research officer will have all of this information. Ask them. And also look over grants from people who have already been awarded grants from them. Does your research profile fit the people who have been funded? Can you get a grant from them to read? That helps when you're writing grants. In industry, build contacts in industry if you're interested in doing industrial research. This includes the pharma industry, but it might include places like Boeing. Can you advance the company's goals? If you're doing drug discovery, do you have an impact on drug discovery? Know that industry works on timelines that are completely distinct from academic timelines. Generally, you'll probably have some months to do the research as opposed to doing 2 years of research. That's that time constraint that we were talking about earlier. Know that also they can provide funding, but also in-kind contributions, which are people hours within the industry, the company, that can help you advance your research. So that's also sometimes really interesting. I've had grants like that where we had no money that was exchanged, but we had access to data, or we had access to people who knew what they were doing, who already had these models, who could help us advance the research that we wanted to do. Also, I forgot to say, please stop me at any point if you have questions. This is going to be somewhat interactive, so I hope you have a pen and a paper or a computer, because we're going to do some grant writing activities. But if you have questions before that, that's no problem. Okay, oops. In terms of government funding, like I said, all of these have recurring funding programs. That's your PGSM, PGSD, PDF scholarships, NSERC Discovery Grants, CIHR project grants 2 times a year, and the SSHRC Insight, which I believe is only once a year. There are some interdisciplinary and interagency funding streams. The new Frontiers in Research Fund is an interdisciplinary one. They run 3 programs: transformation, exploration, and something else that is out of my brain right now. Transformation is like a $20 million grant. It's huge. You'll probably be with like 100 people. You're not going to write that on your own, but just know it exists. An exploration grant is a targeted 2-year grant that you're writing with a smaller team to try and generate, a project that hasn't been done before. They're very competitive. I think the first year that stream came out, they anticipated having like 100 applications, and they had something like 1,500. So just, it's very competitive. But to find out about them, sign up for mailing lists. I know we all get way too much email, but CIHR has a mailing list, NSERC will have a mailing list. They will say what grants are coming out, but they will also be sent out through your institutions. I know we also all get a lot of email from our admin people at our institutions, and they have so much information, but read them, because they announce grants, and they announce the internal deadlines, which is the time you need to get it to your institution and not to the funding agency. And that's very important. And sometimes they ask you to touch base with them before you apply. That's also very important. Don't start a grant without talking to someone at your research office if they ask that, because they may not have the ability to submit your grant. They might only have 2 people that they're allowed to fund. Okay, so that's an overview of grant foundations. I see in the chat somebody mentioned Wellcome Trust. There's also Human Frontiers. That's a good program if they really like interdisciplinary with mathematicians. There's also the Gates Foundation. Gates Foundation usually approaches you, in my experience. I don't think they have open competitions, but somebody can correct me if that's wrong. In my experience, the Gates Foundation comes to you and says, oh, we've seen your research. You should put in a proposal for funding. But that's also a good funding stream. There's also another one, that the Burroughs Wellcome Fund. They have great grants. If you're a postdoc who wants to transition to a faculty career, they have transition grants that are 5 years long. They also have transition grants at the frontiers of biology and math, or like quantitative sciences. They will fund your postdoc and first few years of your faculty appointment. Check that it's available in Canada. I'm pretty sure it is. I know it was available in the US. So that's something that's really useful, those transition grants. The Cancer Research Society also has a transition grant where they'll pay part of your salary. Look for salary grants if that's something that's applicable to you. Most of the time in a math department, you're on hard money, so the university is funding your position. But if you're on soft money in a hospital, for example, you may need to get money to fund your salary, which is less common in Canada, but which does exist. Okay, so now you've decided where you're going to apply. You're going to want to write your grant, and you're probably going to want to have an idea before you write your grant. That's usually a good place to start. What do you want to do when you write this grant? I kind of think of, when I have the idea, the next thing I want to do is think about, what are the objectives? What am I going to do in this grant? And here you want to define these. These are kind of the top level goals. To do your idea, what do you need to achieve? That's what an objective is. And when you write them down, you want to write with verbs because you want to say, I'm going to do something. And I'll show you some examples of things that I've written, or just examples that I've put. Try to avoid too many dependencies. In general, this is impossible. In my opinion, this is my opinion. It's impossible to say I'm going to do all 3 of these things. They're completely distinct, but they will achieve the outcome of this grant. But try not to have aims 2 and 3 that completely depend on aim 1, in which case if aim 1 fails, your entire grant falls apart. Because if a reviewer finds aim 1 and says, actually, this isn't going to work, they'll say this grant won't work. So you want to have kind of complementary goals that will help you achieve your outcomes. But as I said, in my experience, this is mostly impossible. Usually one aim is going to need to depend on something, especially if you're doing math modeling. You're probably going to have like, you're probably going to have aims to build a model and then aim to like use that model. You'll have to convince the people that you're applying to that you can build that model, and that's part of your job. So the SMART system to write objectives, this is from that Harvard course I mentioned. Be specific, be significant. So, don't have like a grant objective that really won't do anything. Measurable, how can you make sure that you're going to achieve the objective? How do you know when it's done? Attainable, relevant, and time-bound. Again, that time is coming in here. Most of the time, time is a huge constraint on your grants. Okay, so let's take, for example, these examples of how to write a grant. My first objective in my grant is to write a fundable grant, and my second one is to do the research. In each objectives, I'm going to define some sort of metric that's a success metric. So evaluation scores, when somebody's reading your grant, they're going to be very competitive, and you need to have funding. You need to show that your grant is going to be above the funding line. The funding line is the killer. You can be fundable. You might have 80% in your overall evaluation, but if the funding line's 85%, you don't get funded. So even if you get an A, it doesn't matter. You need to get, that 87 to be above the funding line, and we'll describe that. I'll describe that for CIHR in a second. My success metrics related to objective 2 are that I'm going to do some research. So what are my successes? I'm going to do that research. I'm going to publish papers. I'm going to give talks, and I'm going to collect some new data to propose my new grant, because that's the game. You get one grant, you do some work, and then you get another grant to continue doing that work. So if you want to be a professor, you'll spend a lot of time writing grants, and that might be why I'm here today, because I spend a lot of time writing grants. So in this objective, I now need to think about how I can do that. So let's focus in on objective 1. Do I need someone else to help me with this grant? Usually, outside of an NSERC discovery grant, you will be writing with collaborators. Discovery grants are for yourself. CIHR grants are rarely by yourself. NFRF, rarely by yourself. Usually you need someone with a complementary expertise to help you do what you're doing. Do you need equipment? NSERC has, for example, the research, and I only know it in French. I think it's RTI in English, right? Research and Technology Infrastructure, something like that. They have a pool of funds for equipment. If you're thinking really big, you can think of a CFI grant. Those are big. Talk to your institution. Don't do that by yourself. That's crazy work. Do you have the team in place to perform the work? Do you have students or somebody, postdocs, collaborators that can help you achieve the goals? If you have a big scope, you're probably going to need someone else besides yourself to do it. It's impossible for you to be doing all of your jobs and doing 100% research. You have to think about who can you delegate to. And do you have evidence that can motivate your approach? Do you have evidence that you can write a fundable grant in this case? Yes, probably. You know how to do research. You probably have worked with someone before, and you have great ideas. So you have evidence that you can do this. If we're thinking more about research, have you done this kind of work before? Can you propose something that is similar to what you've done before, but then can be applied somewhere else? So once you've thought about those questions, you want to think about the tasks that you're going to need to do to obtain your objectives. You're probably going to need to get a team together. You might need to have some preliminary data. That's something like, I've built this model before. We have collaborators who have already gathered this data. If you're proposing to use data in a grant, you either have to say where are you going to get that data from or how you've gotten it already. You can't just say, I'm going to do this, except in an NSERC grant. In an NSERC grant, you can kind of think big and dream a little bit more. It doesn't need to be as concrete. It's more developing a methodology, but it should still be anchored in reality. Don't say you're going to build a rocket ship in 5 years. It's probably not going to work. Touch base with your department and institution. Ask them for help. There's always a research officer. They know way more than you do. My research officers help me so much. They read my grants. They identify funding streams for me to apply to. What are the activities that you then need to do each of those tasks? More granular. These activities will probably become your sub-aims. So you have your objective or your large aim, and then you have sub-aims. What are the things you actually need to do this objective? And so we'll call them activity 1, 2, and 3 here. And so when you have built this all together, how do you know, this is that measurable part, how do you know that your task is completed? What is the milestone that you will use to decide whether your objective, if you get funded, if you're doing this grant, will let you know that you achieved it? And how do you have enough to continue? At this point, you have to think, like, if I did all of this and I got this milestone, will this actually help me do what I need to do in this grant proposal? And so sometimes I start, like, I'm definitely not the most effective grant writer in the sense of, like, there's a lot of backspacing in when I write. Sometimes I write aims and I'm like, this is never gonna work. I've wrote all of it, but like I got to the end and this is impossible to do. Now I need to rethink it. I need to retitle it. I need to think about, what can I do? What kind of data do we have? You might send it to a collaborator who says, oh, I can't actually do what you said I'm gonna do, so we need to pivot. And that's fine. As you're writing, like, things are gonna change. So I thought we could take some time. I'll give you a few minutes, let's say 3 minutes or so, for you to write down 3 objectives or 2 objectives that you might want to do if you're going to write your next grant. What are your ideas and what do you need to do to achieve them? We'll keep using those objectives as we keep going. So I'll just give you some time and I'll be quiet, and you can let me know and just write them down for yourselves. I think that that's a good activity. I'm going to mute the mic so you don't hear me breathing too. So just so you know if you hear it cut. Okay, I'll give everyone about 30 more seconds or so. Luckily, if you're not in the room, you don't know this, but there's actually a seconds timer, so I'll be very precise about it. Okay, so now you've defined your objectives. It's probably a good idea to think about the time aspect. How are you going to do this? And something I really suggest you use is a Gantt chart. You might not have seen a Gantt chart before, but they're in lots of grants. This is basically schedule. No one's going to exactly hold you to this. Actually, some grants do exactly hold you to your grant chart, so be be aware of that. There are some ones, especially grants with industry, where they will ask you, like they're gonna come back to you in a year and say like, have you done these sub-objectives? So be realistic. But think about how your time's gonna be spent. There might be overlapping areas where you're doing both of these activities at one time. You're constructing a model and estimating parameters or gathering data or doing something like that. And that's totally fine. Each of your aims will take some time, and then each of your activities, those subtasks, the sub-aims that we discussed, will take the time for that aim. And usually, you would want all of your aims to take the full time of the grant. Don't propose that you're gonna spend less time, you know? It always takes more time to do research than I think we think it will. And so a Gantt chart is a nice way to put it. Here I've shown months, but sometimes if it's a 5-year grant, I just write years and then divide it up. If it's gonna take me half a year, I use half a box. I made this using a table in Word, or PowerPoint. So that's how I usually make them. You might have a fancier way to make them. There are ways to use Excel to like subtract months, but like you can just color in a table. I think it will work good enough. And usually I try to put this in the actual grant, but most of the time I don't have space. So sometimes I throw this in the budget justification. So read the guidelines, but sometimes you might need to find where you can fit it in. Now, something else I'll just draw your attention to is if this is gonna be printed in black and white, most of the time it's not printed anymore, but if it is, don't use 2 colors that are dark because it'll be, or like if you wanna distinguish things, use colors with gradients, like here, because otherwise it won't show up. So think about it in black and white like we do in our papers. Okay, so actually we've already gotten to activity 2. Now you have your objectives, you have some ideas of your sub-aims. Let's say that your grant is an NSERC grant, so 5 years. How will you divide your time? Think about how you would write out the time you're gonna take for each of your activities. So I'll give you a few more minutes to do that now. And you can write it out like a Gantt chart or just kind of sketch out a timeline for yourself. Okay, I'll give you 30 more seconds. Okay, so now we've thought about what we want to do. We thought about how long it's going to take us. Importantly, let's think about how we're going to fail, because you should identify how you're going to mitigate if you don't achieve what you say you're going to achieve. A reviewer is going to read a grant. Sometimes you will get champions of grants, people who are like, this is the best grant I've ever read. I'm going to fight for this to get funded. And sometimes you're going to get the opposite, and I would say most of the times you're going to get the opposite, which is somebody reading it to say, we don't have a lot of funding, we need to differentiate these grants. How will this fail? Tell them how it will fail and how you're going to make sure it won't fail. The one thing I would say is do not be too negative. I sometimes get this with Students who write their first paper, I say, okay, you need to write the limitations and the conclusions, and they send back like 6 pages of this is how our work was bad. Probably you don't need to go into that much detail. Just say there are some limitations, here they are, and this is why it's not important. That's what you're going to do here. At the end of each objective, you'll probably write, risks and mitigations. Now, I'm talking about objectives and aims because I'm thinking about like a standard grant. NSERC grants, discovery grants have different sections. So follow the sections. They won't be exactly like this. So if our objective is write a fundable grant, the risk is that our grant won't get funded. So what are the mitigation strategies? You would write something like, it is possible that this grant may not be funded. In that case, we propose to use mitigation strategies like using a grant review service or writing multiple grants to make sure that I get funded for something. And we also believe that this won't occur because we have this really strong preliminary data. And from what I've written, I've already convinced you. So you don't need to give tons of, here are like 70 things that I'm going to do to make sure this doesn't fail, because then you're kind of overselling it. But identify where the weaknesses may be and how you're going to deal with those weaknesses. And it may be that you completely pivot. Sometimes I've said, we may not show that this target that we're looking at has a role in this cancer. In that case, we know it has a role in this other cancer, so we'll just study that instead because it'll still be useful, okay? So now take some time, this is the last activity, and then we'll go through the rest of it. Take some time now to think about what the limitations are. It could be per objective. Usually that's how I would think about it, but you might also write like, what are the limitations of your grant? What are you gonna do to mitigate them? What's one thing that you can do that will mitigate that limitation? Okay, I'll give you about 30 seconds to wrap up. And obviously we're going quickly, but you can do these at home, right? Like you don't have to do them in this room. Okay, so what we talked about so far, kind of like pie in the sky, like big ideas, the overall kind of concepts that I think about when I start writing a grant. And I will say that the more you write grants, the more you'll just kind of naturally think about these things in this kind of way. It won't feel so hard, I would say. But how do you actually do it? So what do you write in a grant? So like I said, I'm going to take you through like a general grant structure. NSERC discovery grants are different. You start with like, it's been a long time since I wrote my discovery grant, and probably I'll need to get back into it. But Jessica can say the first section, I think, is your last 5 years, right? Something like that. Yeah. Submitted on Wednesday, completely forgotten. That's good. That's in my tips. Just wait. Okay, so if you're writing a grant, you need to give some background. Why are what you propose to do? Why is what you're proposing to do important? Give some context. most of the time, people who read your grants are not from your field or don't understand exactly what you're going to do. So you need to give a primer, describe what's being done either by yourself or someone else, and emphasize, this is super important, emphasize why there are open problems and you want to study it. Because somebody who works in that field might say, oh, somebody's already done this, or this isn't important, but you need to tell them, actually, what I'm doing is super important. So, for example, say you want to study lung cancer. Usually, with diseases, it's kind of easier because you can always say, here's some statistic about how many people have this disease. It's nice. For example, cancer kills almost 100,000 people in Canada per year, and lung cancer is the most commonly diagnosed cancer there is. That strikes you. If you write, I work on glioblastoma. It's a type of solid tumor in the brain. Its 5-year survival rate is about is 0. Nobody really survives 5 years. Some people do, but it's about that. The median survival time is 15 months. If you write that in a grant, somebody says, okay, this is an important problem. People are dying from this disease. It doesn't have to be like that severe, but that's an example. So bring in something general. Then hit them with some background. Lung cancer is typically treated by surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation therapy. Recent work has focused on the development of new targeted treatments and immunotherapies to improve outcomes. Now, you already see that there's a typo because I forgot to write therapies. Reread your grant so there aren't typos, not like I didn't reread this. Decisions about which treatment to use and for whom are based upon the cancer stage and the patient's genotype. That gives you the background and what is state of the art in the field. Then say, even though we do all of this stuff, it's still the deadliest cancer in Canada. We know how to treat it somewhat. We know how to stratify patients. It doesn't really seem to be helping as much as we'd hope. It's still not clear how to personalize therapy for lung cancer. By the way, this is a fictitious example. I don't work in lung cancer, but from what I remember from talks, these are mostly true, but do not take my word for all of this. Here we propose the opening at the end. You'll probably have a longer introduction than this where you do some reference, literature review, but whatever. Here we propose to provide improved solutions for planning therapy, combining clinical data and statistical modeling. What's the problem and what are you going to do? And then you could go into some more background. So you'd have an introduction, probably, if you've got an 8-page grant, 3/4 of a page. If you can get your aims on your first page, that's really great. If you're writing an NIH grant, your aims have to go on the first page. You want to say what you're going to do as fast as you can, okay? But with context before you do it. You've given your intro. We've made this large opening to the world breaking or the very state-of-the-art research you're going to do. Now you have to describe your objective, the hypothesis of your research, and the aims. These are the objectives that you just wrote down. So you're going to describe the large goal. What is the reason for this grant? It's probably in your title. I write titles last. You might write titles first. It depends on how you see the world. What are your specific hypotheses or the specific hypothesis you're going to test in the grant? Sometimes it's hard with math to say what we're testing, but you can kind of think of, I'll show you how I wrote it. Enumerate the specific aims that you're going to do, and I emphasize again, use active language because you're going to be doing the grant, so use a verb. The overall goal of this research is to get an A in this class. This is an example I use in my grad classes, so this is why it's written like that. How are you going to do that? I hypothesize that completing my final project successfully will lead to a good mark because it's worth 50%, so probably I'll do well. I'm going to investigate this hypothesis. Obviously, this is ridiculous. You would never do this in real life, but through the following specific aims. What are you going to do? I'm going to successfully critique an existing article in the literature. This is their final project. Develop an evolutionary dynamics model fit to data, and to write a great fundable grant proposal. Those are my 3 aims. That's what I'm going to do. Okay? So again, you don't have to use the to part. It could just be successfully critique. It's kind of nicer. If they can fit on one line, that's great. It saves yourself room because you might rewrite your aim title later on. And then if it's 2 lines, you're going to have to cut somewhere else. And they're succinct and to the point. And they're also related to the overall goal of what you wanted to do. Then you're going to get into the experimental approach and the methodology. So for each aim, I like to, again, this is my opinion, so like do not take this as the world, like the overall, you have to do this. I like to describe the rationale. One paragraph might bring back something I wrote in the intro. Why is this aim specifically important? The methods I'm going to use in that aim. If I have a 2-page grant, this might be kind of all jumbled together in like one paragraph. It depends on how long your grant proposal is. The outlook, what will happen if you achieve this aim? And again, the limitations and the alternative approaches. So this is the big meat of it. So this is where you really get into it. You need to provide enough details for a reviewer to know whether what you're doing is doable and makes sense, and can answer a specific question. However, I would say, if you're going to CIHR and you're going to write a math proposal, you don't need to write like, then I will use like ergodic theory to like that nobody will understand that. They're health researchers, and like I've been on CIHR panels. I'm the only mathematician. No one will understand that. Write something that for the people who will be reviewing your grant. I propose to look long-term using my model about what will happen, something like that. Then you'll write an impact statement. This is for your overall goal. We also write probably some outlook statements in your aims. For each aim, describe the importance of this work, what are the possible extensions, and where else could this apply? That's really important. Because you're not just doing this research for this one specific thing. You'll probably have like extensions. It might be your next grant. So already start to think about that. For example, the ever-increasing proximity of humans and animals will continue to fuel the emergence of infectious agents of zoonotic origins. That's my context statement. Then I have, why is this important? This research will contribute to a better quantitative understanding of the factors driving infectious diseases, emerging infectious diseases. The proposed research represents a significant step forward to probe these intersecting elements and predict future pandemics. That's not probably specific enough. You want to say why, but I made this up, so I haven't done this research, so I don't know why. And then lastly, this proposal fulfills the need to forecast global public health threats, whether they be zoonotic in origin or not. So actually, this work could be really important for other things too. Okay, that's a nice impact statement. You might have this at each aim, maybe a bit more succinct, but also at the end of the grant. What will your grant do and why should it be funded? So here are some tips, and this is kind of the end piece. I left a bit of time for questions. Start early. Everyone says that and no one does it, so I threw it out there. Sometimes I start early. I'm 2 weeks ahead on one grant that I'm writing, and I feel like I've accomplished my life goals. If it's your first grant, do it early. Start really early. I wrote my first NSERC grant like 5 months before it was due. Now I probably don't take that much time, right? But I had never really I'd written scholarships, but I'd never really written a grant. I took time to read other people's grants. I took time to think about what I wanted to do, to read the literature, to understand the rules of the program. Those things are important. Ask someone, colleagues, people in this room, whatever, if you can read their grants, whether they're the same program or not. It's helpful to see how people write, because as much as we want to say you're just evaluated on the science, you're not. You are evaluated on whether you fit in the grant writing scheme. Do you use the kinds of words and formatting that looks fundable? My first CIHR grant, I didn't do this. I'd written an NIH grant, so I just followed the same structure, and I definitely did not get funded. And the reviewer said, this grant looks crazy. Like, I don't understand why it is structured this way. It makes no sense, because that's not how CIHR writes. So they looked at it and they were like, this person doesn't know what they're doing. And as much as we don't want to think that that counts, it counts. So read grants, ask people. Most people are really nice about giving you a grant, especially if it's something that's being funded, because you're probably not going to compete with them on it. Somebody who's writing a grant in the same competition probably won't share their grant with you. So be, judicious about it, but people usually will share their grants. And your research office might have previous grants, and if you search the internet, there's probably previous grants. Pay attention to instructions and formatting. For example, I just had something that was full justified because that gets you so much extra space in Word, but the competition rule said left justification. and it bumped my grant from 1 paragraph over the limit to 5 paragraphs over the limit, or something crazy. So read the instructions early and don't be like me. Usually they say what size font you need and like all of that kind of stuff. They've caught on to the trick of using exact spacing. Exact 12 spacing will get you more space than single line spacing, but I know, for example, CIHR has told people not to do that anymore. Include supporting figures. It might be your preliminary data. It might be conceptual. And here are some examples of things that would be really nice to put in a grant. Here, this is obviously designed, this is from a paper, but it's a summary of what you're thinking about in the grant, what this research will do. And this is really convincing. If you can convince somebody that this is what I'm thinking about, this is how it all links up, somebody will say, okay, this is probably important. This is something that I probably use a little bit more, a conceptual overview of what the grant does. You know that figure I showed at the beginning with that virtual patient thing? That too, great, put that in a grant. Maybe not that it's too fancy, but something that gets your point across without you having to use a caption that's super long because you're gonna lose space. So something that you can look at the figure and understand what's going on, really useful. In grants and in papers, think about a graphical abstract, right? Graphical abstracts summarize what you're doing. Get someone to read your grant. So I didn't mention it, but institutions will have grant preparations things in a general sense, like the Harvard Catalyst Grant program I took, but also specific. So I've gone to some for how to write this specific grant. Super, super useful. The research officers are the people who submit all the grants from all of the institution. They've read hundreds of grants. They will tell you what gets funded. Use their tips. And institutions will have review services. If you submit by certain time, somebody else will read your grant. Even if they just read it for formatting, that already helps. But in, like at hospital research centers, for example, we have a very detailed review service, like 3 people read your grant. Get somebody to read it, even if it's just your mentor, if it's your first discovery grant and they can read it, that will be really helpful because you'll get their tips. And I put family and friends, which seems weird, but actually you won't see typos after you've been looking at something for a long time. Get somebody to read it. Your family doesn't work in your research field. If they don't understand, they won't understand 100%, but if they don't understand like 20% of what you're doing, you might need to not dumb it down, but you might need to like be more clear, let's put it that way. And read the evaluation criteria. Here's NSERC's discovery criteria. It's awful, but this is the grid that reviewers use to evaluate your grant. They will tell you how you get from exceptional to insufficient. And in NSERC, they use bins to decide who gets funded. That's their funding stream. You need to get a lot of exceptional and outstanding to be in those top ones. How do you do that? Make sure you address the things that they're evaluating you on. Make sure that your grant falls within this structure. If it's NSERC, you're not going to want to have a disease-specific focus, and you don't want to play up the disease-specific things because they're going to say, we don't fund that kind of research. Just to give you an idea of how CIHR evaluates, so you're going to submit your grant. It's a committee. I can't remember exactly how Discovery does. I think it's similar to this, but I participate in CIHR, so I can tell you. Then we, as reviewers, go onto the portal, and we say, we see your summary and we say, okay, I know what this is, and I have high, medium, or low expertise on it, or I have no expertise. So I say which grants I might know something about. CIHR gives me my grants, anywhere from probably in any committee 3 to 6, and 3 reviewers are each. The first reviewer knows the grant stuff the best. The third reviewer might have less knowledge. Then you evaluate and give preliminary scores. Each grant, if I get 6 grants, they're 8 pages long, plus all the CVs, plus all that other stuff. Like, be succinct, be clear. Don't jam too much stuff in, because as I'm reading it at night, I probably am gonna like totally gloss over that. Then the grants are ranked by scores. And in CIHR, the bottom 50% aren't discussed. So firstly, be in that top 50%. Next, all of those grants that are going to be discussed in your committee are discussed. Sometimes we can pull grants out. That's where your champion comes in. If somebody says, I loved this grant, like it needs to be discussed, they'll pull it out, but most of the time that doesn't happen because it's 3 days long and we're all tired. So don't get streamlined, but I've also been streamlined, so don't worry about it. The discussion happens, the first person reads it, says their evaluation, the second person, the third person, the committee discusses, and then the committee, based on the discussion, gives the final score. So if you don't have somebody who can champion your grant, sometimes they fall after the discussion. Once all the scores are in from all the committees, the funding line is assessed. The federal government says to CIHR, you have X amount of money for this program this year. They say you have to be above this percentile in your committee. That means that there might be anywhere from 1 to 8 grants in any committee that are funded. And then your grant is funded, and usually they cut your budget, so you don't get as much money as you thought you were going to have, and then you deal with it. So that's how the CIHR process works, two project competitions per year. To know how this happens, you can participate in things like the CIHR reviewer and training program. I did this, it was super useful. You go there, you don't actually have to really participate, but your scores don't count. It's to practice writing reviews. You have to apply, but I would suggest that you apply. If you can get into it, it's really great. You'll sit in on a CIHR competition. You will see how the process works. You will understand what people look for in grants and what they're going to discuss when they look at your grant. So you can look that up. I think they do a call each project competition. You probably need to be at least a postdoc or an early career researcher. So you need to have a position maybe. And then lastly, as discussed, once you submit your grant, forget it. It's probably not going to get funded because most grants aren't funded. Don't tie yourself up and your self-worth to whether your grants are funded, because you will be very sad overall in your life. So once it's submitted, I mean, this is easy to say from this lectern, I think, but try to forget it. You probably won't forget it. Try not to put all of your eggs in one basket. Think about your other grants that you're going to write. And also don't be so wrapped up that you think like the world's going to end if you don't get it funded. That's probably not true. Make backup plans. How else will you get funded? What other places can you go? Generate some new preliminary data, do something else that'll get you your next grant. And so that's all I had to say. I thought I was going to have so much time, but my planning wasn't the best. So I just want to say, these are the people in my lab who helped me write grants, and Xiaoyan can attest to that because she's written grants and scholarships with me. That's a picture from this summer, but not everyone's here still. So we have not much time, but if you have questions, you can always email me or email your mentors or whatever. And I can give you some tips or try and help you if I can. I mean, as I said, these are just my opinions. I don't know if this is the way to write grants. This is how I write grants. So thanks very much.